sequel to Fingerprints of the Gods. In this talk I'm going to review some of the evidence that I covered in Fingerprints of the Gods, and I'm also going to share some of the new material, including Göbekli Tepe, that has made me feel the time is right to produce a sequel to Fingerprints of the Gods, because that controversial case of a lost civilization that was so widely scorned and dismissed in 1995 is much stronger in 2015, which is when the book will be published. And we'll begin on the Giza Plateau, and with, of course, the last surviving wonder of the ancient world, the Great Pyramid, which I know many in this room have visited and been stunned by. And those are the statistics: 13.1 acre footprint, 6 million tons in weight, 2.3 million individual blocks of stone. It's thought that the lost casing stone, which came off in an earthquake in 1301, consisted of 115,000 shaped blocks weighing 10 tons each. They are now part of the architecture of Cairo, having been used as a quarry for the building of mosques and palaces all over Cairo. And that they covered an area of 22 acres, and the angle of slope is 52 degrees. And should you wish to climb the Great Pyramid illegally, this is the corner I recommend, which is the southwest corner. Bear that in mind. Egypt is a country where things can be done with money, and it is still possible to climb the Great Pyramid at night, and sometimes at other times just part with a few Egyptian pounds and take your life in your hands. 52 degrees, follow that corner, try to go up any other side, you're going to get lost. This corner, I've also been up the southeast corner, but it is much more difficult climb than the southwest corner. Santa and I have climbed the Great Pyramid 5 times altogether. The pyramids tower over modern Cairo, and you have this epic sense of a remote and mysterious past which hangs over that cluttered, noisy city. And Santa took this photograph from an Egyptian military helicopter hovering over the village of Nazlet al-Saman at the foot of the Giza Plateau. And we are right now northeast of the Great Pyramid complex. And it's a sign of how enormous these pyramids are that the Great Sphinx is actually quite difficult to see in the picture. The Great Sphinx being 70 feet high and 270 feet long, and there is Sphinxy sitting there gazing across the Nile Valley. Let's swing round now to the western side, and we're looking at the north faces of the 3 Great Pyramids here. We can see why Egypt is referred to as the gift of the Nile, since this is the Nile Valley, full of fertility and life, while off to the west is the sere and inhospitable Western Desert. There would be no life in Egypt were it not for the amazing fertility and gift of the Nile Valley. And again, here is the Sphinx gazing east across the Nile Valley. Come closer now, and forgive me if some of you have seen parts of this before on YouTube, but this is a story I really like to tell. Here is the north faces of the 3 Great Pyramids, where the true entrances of all of them are found. This is Mamun's Hole, which was the Arabs breaking into the Great Pyramid in the 9th century. At that time, the true entrance up here was hidden by the facing stones and was lost. And that's the entrance that we all go in today, through Mamun's Hole. Closer and closer again, and you can see that there is half a course of masonry left on the south side at the top of the Great Pyramid. We don't know if the Great Pyramid was ever completed, as the second pyramid certainly was, but you can see the work of the facing stones left at the top part of the second pyramid. And you must envisage the Great Pyramid as at one time being entirely covered in highly polished limestone facing stones like this. And finally, we get to the very top, and there I am, a much younger man before my hip was replaced. But I still think I could leap up there like a mountain goat, thanks to the wonders of modern surgery. this was one of our illegal climbs. We did actually a couple of legal ones where you have to sign your life away at the bottom and tell the Egyptian police that if you have a fatal accident, you and your descendants will not hold the Egyptian government responsible. And you can see that there's a lot of graffiti cut into the blocks on the top of the Great Pyramid. Some famous names are there, including Gerard Mercator, the map maker who's responsible for the Mercator projection, who climbed the Great Pyramid in the 1500s. Just one step below me here, I found a very familiar name, which was the name P. Hancock, with the date 5th of April 1916. And this is the story I love to tell. Forgive me if you've heard it before, but my grandfather was called Philip Hancock, and he was a chaplain with British forces in the First World War in Egypt. So I had to think that that might have been my grandfather who left his graffiti there. But I could check it because my father had my grandfather's diaries, which were inscribed on tiny little diary books, dozens of them actually. And I called him up after we came down, and I asked him to fish out Grandpa's diaries, which I knew he kept in the drawer in his desk in his study, and to search for the date 5th of April 1916. And I heard him rustling through the pages, and finally he came back on the line and he said, "Yeah, I found it, but there's just one line here." I said, "What does that line say, Dad?" He said, "Climbed Great Pyramid today." So I do feel a connection. So sadly, my father passed away in 2003. Santa and I took him to the Great Pyramid in 1999, but he was already in quite an advanced state of cancer at that time and was unable to climb the pyramid, although I know he would have loved to do so. So the Great Pyramid stands on latitude 30 degrees north. This is not a random latitude, of course. It's 1/3 of the way between the equator and the North Pole. According to Egyptologists, it is a random latitude. Everything about the Great Pyramid is random because it was created by semi-savages who were incapable of thinking logically about anything. So it's an accident that it's situated on latitude 30 degrees north. It's also a kind of accident as well that it's just almost perfectly aligned to true north, within 3/60ths of a single degree. This is one of the reasons why I don't feel I need aliens to explain the Great Pyramid. Because aliens who had the technology to cross interstellar space would have the technology to align this monument perfectly to true north. It's almost perfect. It's incredibly good workmanship. As human workmanship go, it's uncannily good. But I don't think it's interstellar space technology. Likewise, the side lengths of the Great Pyramid vary by as much as 7 inches. That across 750 feet isn't much either. But again, if you were interstellar traveling aliens and you built this, I think you would get it spot on. I think it bears all the hallmarks of human workmanship of a very advanced level, much more advanced than history gives credit for in the epoch of 2500 BC. So it's just 3/60ths of a degree off true north across that whole 13-acre footprint. And it really takes astronomy to align the monument that precisely. It tells us that the builders were astronomers. This I went into in Fingerprints of the Gods. I think it's highly significant that that the dimensions of the Earth are built in to the dimensions of the Great Pyramid on a scale of 1 to 43,200. Again, Egyptologists are aware of this, and again, in their way, they say that it's a total coincidence and it has no meaning whatsoever. But if you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. And if you measure accurately the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by the same number, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. And it's interesting that Isaac Newton in the 1600s had an intuition, or perhaps it was based on his studies of ancient texts, that the dimensions of the Earth were coded in the Great Pyramid. And he sent John Greaves from Oxford to measure the Great Pyramid at that time on the assumption that they could scale up the Great Pyramid and get the dimensions of the Earth. John Greaves was not able to do an accurate measurement because the pyramid was covered to a great height in sand at that point. But it's interesting that Isaac Newton had that idea. Certainly in 2500 BC, when this monument is supposed to have been built, it is held by mainstream academics that nobody had knowledge of the dimensions of the Earth. Indeed, did not even know that we lived on a planet. But there you go. In all the centuries of darkness, when we did not know the dimensions of the Earth, and indeed didn't know that we lived on a planet, if you really, all you had to do was measure the Great Pyramid, scale it up by 43,200, and you would get precisely a printout of the dimensions of our planet. It's one of the ways, along with that orientation to true north, that the Great Pyramid speaks to the planet on which it is placed. I don't think it's coincidental at all, because this is not at all a random number. This is a highly significant number, and it belongs to a sequence of numbers that themselves relate to a key motion of the Earth, and that motion is the precession of the equinoxes. And again, I went into this at great length in Fingerprints of the Gods, and indeed had to teach myself astronomy and mathematics in order to write Fingerprints of the Gods, because that's one of the things the Great Pyramid does. If you really get into studying it, it starts initiating you into learning stuff that you don't know before. It is an initiatory device. At any rate, the precession is thought to be caused by a wobble on the axis of the Earth, caused by the competing gravities of the Sun and the Moon. My friend Walter Cruttenden, who runs the Binary Research Institute, has a different explanation. He thinks that it's because our solar system is in orbit around the star Sirius, and that the great circle in the heavens that our sun makes as it travels around the star Sirius would produce the same observable as the wobble on the axis of the Earth that is hypothesized by geographers today. But let's just go with the wobble theory for the moment, and what it is, it's rather like a spinning top, which when it's slowing down begins to do this, and what it means is it's most observable at the pole star. Today our pole star is Polaris. That's the star that the north pole of the Earth points almost perfectly at, not quite. But there have been other times in history, over a great cycle of 25,920 years, when the pole star has been another star, or indeed when the pole is pointed at a blank area of empty space. It's observable there, and it's observable on the horizon, particularly at the equinoxes, also at the solstices, at any time of year actually, but on those key moments of year. The background stars that rise behind the sun on those key moments of the year shift very gradually in, again, this great cycle that takes 25,920 years to complete, and that was referred to as the Great Year by the ancients. And that cycle operates at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. And if you take 360 and multiply that by 72, you get 25,920, which is the entire cycle of the Great Year, when the clock resets and starts again from the place it was 25,920 years before. And that ratio, 43,200, is based on the number 72. It's exactly 600 times the number 72. So I would say if the ratio was 1 to 57,815, it would be less impressive than it is at 1 to 43,200, because that is a significant ratio relating to a key motion of the Earth itself. And furthermore, it belongs to a series of numbers that are found in ancient mythology all around the world. 72 is the heartbeat of the cycle, but you find these numbers related to 72. 72 divided by 2 is 36, 72 plus 36 is 108, half of 108 is 54, 108 times 2 is 216, 72 times 30 degrees in each house of the zodiac is 2,160, and so on and so forth, 4,320, 43,200. You can add zeros, but basically what you're doing is you're building a whole sequence of numbers based on the precessional cycle. These numbers are found all over the famous Mayan calendar. They're a central feature of the number system of the Mayan calendar. They are found in ancient mythology all around the world, and it was proposed by Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deschend. Giorgio de Santillana was the professor of the history of science at MIT. I highly recommend his book, Hamlet's Mill. It's a mind-bending book. It requires incredible dedication to read and to study it. I think that just as he was speaking of an ancient code, he also encoded his key message in that book in very abstruse language because he realized that he was sitting on academic dynamite. And what he was saying was and he does say it actually in plain words at one point in the footnote in the text, that his explanation for this is that the precession was completely observed and understood by some almost unbelievable ancestor civilization of remote antiquity. That's what he says. And that they chose, that for some reason it was so important to them that they chose to encode it in myth and in architecture, and that their belief was that if they encoded it in good enough mythological stories, the storyteller did not need to know the essence of the information he or she was transmitting. All they needed to do was tell the story true, and the information would be carried down the generations in this way, and thus preserved for the future, for a time when, again, people might understand the precession of the equinox. At Giza, as well as the precessional element in the Great Pyramid, the Great Sphinx is part of an overall precessional design. And the Great Sphinx, between whose paws stands a stela dating to the reign of Thutmosis IV, so-called dream stela, because Thutmosis fell asleep in the shadow of the Sphinx and had a dream that he was to clear and renovate the Sphinx, which at that time was covered up to its shoulders in sand. And after he'd done that and done an extensive renovation, he put up this stela there, which recorded his great contribution to the Sphinx. On that stela in line 13, until about 60 years ago, there was a half of a syllable, there was a single syllable kaf, which was not surrounded by a royal cartouche. But believe it or not, that single syllable kaf that appeared on a stela that was put there a very long time after the Sphinx was created, that Moses reigned about 1400 BC. On the basis of that single syllable kaf, Egyptologists have given the Sphinx to Khafre, the pharaoh. They're saying that Thutmosis was telling us that Khafre built the Sphinx, although the rest of the line is missing. That's their conclusion, because that fits their picture of history. It could easily have not been referring to Khafre at all, since there was no cartouche around it. And it might have been saying that Khafre was an earlier restorer of the Sphinx, and that Thutmosis had simply come along and restored it later. Something else of greater interest on this stela is that it tells us the Sphinx marks the splendid place of the first time. The first time is an important concept in ancient Egyptian ideas. It's called Zep Tepi, and it is the time when the gods walked the earth, and it is set in a remote epoch deep in the past. The Sphinx is connected to that epoch, according to Thutmosis. Now, if you get up on the Sphinx's back illegally, then this is what you'll see. That's the back of the Sphinx's head, and if you're there at the summer solstice, you're going to see the sun rising way over here, very far to the north of east. And if you're there at the winter solstice, you're going to see the sun rising way over here, very far to the south of east. But should you get up there on the spring equinox, the 21st of March, or indeed the autumn equinox, the 21st of September, when the sun rises perfectly due east, this is what you'll see. You will see the sun rising directly in alignment with the gaze of the Sphinx. And this is what the Sphinx is there to do. The Sphinx is an equinoctial marker. It is there to marry heaven and earth, and it will always gaze at the rising sun at dawn on the spring equinox. And what will change is the background stars behind the sun, that lie on the horizon where the sun will rise. If you go there an hour before dawn in our epoch, you'll find that we're near the end of the constellation of Pisces. And we've been in the constellation of Pisces, the age of the fish, for the last 2,000 plus years. And therefore it's not an accident that the ancient Christians used the fish as their symbol. Before the age of Pisces, it was the age of Aries. This was the time when ancient Egyptian symbolism was predominantly rams, the ram avenues of Karnak, for example. Before that, it's the age of Taurus, the bull. We have the Apis bull ceremony in ancient Egypt. The symbolism of bulls is key in the previous precessional epoch. And in our time, we're just on the cusp of Aquarius, of Pisces and Aquarius. And that's what it means by the song, "We live in the dawning of the age of Aquarius." We do indeed. We're not quite there yet, as we all know, but we're on the cusp. We're in one of those cusp moments in human history as the zodiac tells our story. And it certainly feels like a cusp moment today. So the precession operates in the opposite direction through the zodiac to our annual passage through the zodiac. Instead of going Aquarius, Pisces, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, it goes the opposite way. Leo, Cancer, Gemini, Taurus, Aries, Pisces, Aquarius. And it does so at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years, and the total of the Great Year is 25,920 years. And as my good friend and oft-time co-author Robert Boval has, I think Robert's contribution to Egyptology is enormous. And I think in future generations he'll be recognised as a genius who really cracked the essential code of the pyramid. I personally am in no doubt. I know Andy disagrees, but I'm personally in no doubt that Robert is correct about his Orion correlation theory. The constellation of Orion was seen as the celestial image of the god Osiris, who presides over life and death, the king of the netherworld. And it's highly appropriate that his image should be placed upon the ground in this extraordinary site, the Giza Plateau. And Robert and I, working together on Key Proof Genesis in 1996, precessing the skies using astronomical software, which is something that you can do very easily. In ancient times, you had to have an incredibly gifted mind to envisage the changes in the skies, and really good math. But now with computer software, anybody can do it. And there's just this really interesting thing that happens at dawn on the spring equinox in 10,500 BC. Actually, it's pretty good between 10,000 and 11,000 BC. Precessional changes operate very slowly. And that is that just at the moment that the sun breaks the horizon, with the constellation of Leo the Lion housing the sun at that time, at that exact moment, like the two arms of a clock, the constellation of Orion is crossing the meridian due south. The meridian is the north-south line that divides the sky above your head. Constellation is crossing the meridian due south just as the sun strikes the horizon. And therefore we don't think it's an accident, and we don't think it can be explained away in any other way, that at this time you have a lion-bodied monument gazing at its own image in the sky, and you have the three pyramids on the ground in a very close resemblance to the pattern of the three stars of the belt of Orion, as you would intuitively draw them if you looked at the sky and made a drawing of the three pyramids of the ground and then laid that drawing flat on the ground in front of you. We don't think that this is an accident at all. We think it speaks very strongly of the correctness of the Orion correlation and of the role of Leo, and the whole thing appears to be an attempt to bring down heaven to earth, as above, so below. Not in the epoch of 2500 BC. You'd have to be astronomically illiterate to build an equinoctial marker in the form of a lion in 2500 BC. If you were going to build that equinoctial marker in 2500 BC, you'd have to build it in the form of a bull, because that's the age of Taurus. It's absurd to suggest that they would have made a lion equinoctial marker at that time. But that's what we have. And since Osiris was said to have ruled in Zep Tepe the first time, we shouldn't be surprised that the astronomical layout of the site hints at extremely ancient origins. I think that they're using precessional astronomy to draw attention to the epoch between 10,000 BC and 11,000 BC, between 12,000 and 13,000 years ago. Of course, I'm not saying that whoever created this amazing thing actually put the River Nile there to mirror the Milky Way, but I am suggesting that the site was chosen, that one of the reasons the site was chosen was because of that sky-ground correlation that occurs geographically at that time. Now, in my book Heaven's Mirror, I looked at the relationship of a number of sites around the world which are divided by significant degrees of longitude in precessional terms. Again, that number 72 is key. You don't notice it today with the prime meridian drawn through Greenwich for historical reasons. You have to actually do the calculations, but when you do the calculations, you find that Giza is separated from Angkor in Cambodia by exactly 72 degrees of longitude. It'd be much easier to notice if you set your prime meridian at 0. Then suddenly all these sites slot into place around the world, separated by significant degrees of longitude in terms of that scale which we've shown is so important at many, many sites. And let's just jump over to Angkor now, which has 72 major temples, and where we find Angkor Wat with a distinct pyramidal structure of its own. Scholars would say it's a coincidence, but Angkor actually means, in ancient Egyptian, life to the Horus. Now, I do not dispute that the temples of Angkor which I first visited with Santhe in 1997 and have visited multiple times since then, I don't dispute that the temples of Angkor were built in their present incarnation in the 1100s AD. That's a no-brainer. They definitely were. They date from the 1100s AD. But I think they're simply the latest incarnations of much earlier temples that were built on that site. I think that it's been a sacred site for thousands and thousands of years. And recent archaeology is beginning to demonstrate that there is a much older sublayer at Angkor. We're on the east side here looking west. See how that causeway runs through the center of Angkor on the east-west axis, and it's perfectly oriented east-west and north-south. Causeway disappears across the moat and then vanishes over the horizon about 8 or 10 miles away. Again, this shot Santhe took from a military helicopter. Interesting thing happens if you stand smack in the middle of that causeway, roughly there at dawn on the spring equinox, the same time that the Sphinx marks, the same time of year that the Sphinx marks. If you stand there at dawn and look east at the rising sun, you see it peep up over the central tower, roll up the side of the tower, and finally sit perfectly squarely on top of the central tower at dawn on the spring equinox. And of course, that's when you understand whatever else Angkor is meant to do, it's definitely meant to speak to this moment. It's marrying heaven and earth. It's an equinoctial marker, just as the Sphinx is. And I got into a lot of trouble for pointing out that the principal temples of Angkor are laid out in the pattern of a constellation, which is the constellation of Draco. This again is supposed to be a complete coincidence, or indeed a figment of my imagination and my researchers' imagination, because it was John Grigsby who first spotted that. Actually, I don't think it is a figment of the imagination. The relationship between the constellation of Draco and the key temples of Angkor is very strong, and it even extends to the temples down near Roloas, and it extends to the western Mebon, where we do see Cygnus coming into the picture, it involves a number of peripheral stars as well as the key stars of Draco. And what's really fascinating about it is that the correlation only works perfectly on the spring equinox between 10,000 and 11,000 BC, the exact same date that Giza prints out. So I have the sense that an enormous effort is being made to use stars and architecture to draw attention to a particular time that in our calendar we call between 10,000 and 11,000 BC. And interestingly, the same thing is done at the Hoover Dam. The Hoover Dam, this shows that our culture is doing things that the ancients were also doing. The Hoover Dam has a huge work of sculpture built into it. And Oscar Hansen, who was responsible for the star map set in the floor of the monument, believed that in remote ages to come, intelligent people with knowledge of precession would be able to discern the astronomical time of the dam's dedication, because he froze the stars above the dam at the moment of the dam's dedication. Now, in a sense, I mean, who gives a damn, when the Hoover Dam was? But what this tells us is that the idea of using a universal language of astronomy and architecture to speak to certain dates is perhaps not so strange as it might seem at first, because we ourselves do it. After all, you cannot predict in 10 or 12,000 years' time that the language you speak will be understood by anybody. We're only 5,000 years away from the Indus Valley civilization, and we can't translate their language today. It's a completely unknown text to us. 12,000 years, who knows whether English or whatever language was spoken 12,000 years ago would ever be spoken or ever be understood. Or even if it was, if any inscriptions would survive that length of time. But if you create gigantic monuments, or if you create a tradition that will keep rebuilding monuments on the same site, and if you lock in the stars, then you actually have an incredibly effective way of specifying a particular time frame and drawing attention to that time frame. And then the question becomes, why is that time frame so important that it deserves this kind of effort? The ancient Egyptians had a very clear idea of the vast antiquity of their origins. And this is expressed in what are called king lists. And in fact, Egyptologists derive the orthodox chronology of Egypt from ancient Egyptian king lists, one of which we are looking at here. And this is just another way that I think the Egyptologists cherry-pick the past. Because this king list, in which the pharaoh Seti I is showing his young son Ramesses II a list of all the pharaohs who'd ruled before their time, and this is found in the temple of Seti I at Abydos. It's rather intriguing because It doesn't stop, annoyingly for Egyptologists, it doesn't stop in the first dynasty in 3000 BC. It just keeps on going back for thousands and thousands and thousands of years earlier. In fact, it goes back about 36,000 years. So Egyptologists, they say that stuff earlier than 3000 BC, they were just making that up. That's all myth. But the stuff from 3000 BC down to the end of ancient Egypt, we'll buy that. That's history, because that fits with our prejudices about the past. Clear sense of a remote antiquity in the ancient Egyptians' story of themselves. And I personally think that the ancient Egyptians knew more about their own past than Egyptologists do. Behind the Temple of Seti I is this amazing structure, the Osirion, which is about 50 feet lower and which was covered in sediment until the early 1900s when it was exposed and excavated. This temple has been given to Seti I because it's very close to the Temple of Seti I. And because there are a couple of, down in this corridor here, there are a couple of inscriptions that relate to Seti I. My suggestion is that Seti I, and I'm not the only person to make the suggestion, that Seti I indeed did know that temple, and he did put some inscriptions in that corridor, but I don't think he built it at all. I think it belongs to a much earlier time and to a very different style of architecture, a megalithic style of architecture that we do find elsewhere in Egypt. There's the entrance gateway to the Osirion, and we have to ask ourselves what's involved in moving blocks like this. And in answer to that question, the Egyptologists will tell you thousands of slaves laboring in loincloths, but I much prefer this idea, really, which is a little bit of magic, a little bit of a cow, a little bit of psychic power, a little bit of sound, the stuff that we read the ancient Egyptians telling us about in their own traditions of the movement of large blocks, that it wasn't done with mechanical advantage and leverage at all. Other megalithic sites that we find, like the so-called mortuary temples on the Giza Plateau, giant blocks of stone, in some cases, in the case of the mortuary temples, weighing 200 tons, and then the Valley Temple, where there are several blocks weighing 100 tons, and others in the range of 60 to 80 tons. The Valley Temple attributed to Khafre. Well, a statue of Khafre was found upside down in a pit in the Valley Temple. That's about the only reason to attribute it to Khafre. Who says he put his statue upside down there? Maybe that was dumped there by some later culture. Who knows when? The claim of Khafre's association with the Valley Temple is very slim. But I do, of course, accept that the ancient Egyptians were involved in the Valley Temple. I think they were involved in renovating it. I think the granite work inside the Valley Temple and the way the granite is fitted to the much older limestone walls is the work of the ancient Egyptians, but I think they were working on a much older site. And here is the Sphinx, and here is the Sphinx Temple, here's the Valley Temple. If the Sphinx is older, which is the very strong suggestion of the work of Professor Robert Schoch, who was first brought to Giza by our friend John Anthony West in 1990, John had an intimation, actually from the work of Schwaller de Lübeck's, that the Sphinx had been weathered by water, and he thought it would be a good idea to bring a credentialed geologist to explore that possibility. And so he brought Robert Schoch, and Robert Schoch very quickly realized that the Sphinx was indeed weathered by water. Not the way John had thought. John had thought there'd been some kind of flood lying in here. But what Schoch realized was that the water weathering was caused by precipitation, as he was outlining in the talk on the bus tonight, and that thousands of years of heavy rainfall had created these deep vertical fissures, which are now most easily seen in the trench surrounding the Sphinx, because the Sphinx has been continuously restored down the ages. Very bizarre that a monument built in 2500 BC, the Old Kingdom, actually has Old Kingdom restoration blocks on it. Why were they restoring it if they built it then? The sense is that it must be much older than that. And if it's older, then so are these temples, because these temples are built out of limestone blocks that were cut from the trench that surrounds the Sphinx. In fact, the Sphinx's core body was created by removing this area of limestone and building it up into these temples here. And therefore, if the Sphinx is 12,000 plus years old, then these temples are 12,000 plus years old, and that means we're looking at a very high level of technology and culture in that period, which of course is regarded as complete idiocy by mainstream archaeology. And one of the killer arguments against the older Sphinx back in the 90s was
show me one other site which is 12,000 years old, which is built out of megaliths, you know. Show me, there was no culture in the world 12,000 years ago that was capable of that level of organization. If there was, we would find other sites. And this was presented as the killer argument of Egyptology against the notion of the older Sphinx, which hugely upset Egyptologists, by the way. I mean, Robert Schoch and John Anthony West planted a bomb under the capacious bums of Egyptologists. And that bomb has recently exploded in the form of Göbekli Tepe, because Göbekli Tepe, which is actually really near the Sphinx, is 12,000 years old. And this is what you're going to see tomorrow. And this is just to give you a sense of the look of the place and the scale of the place. That's me there, and that's Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who exposed and explored the site since the 1990s. And you just get a sense of the gigantic scale of the whole place, and the epic feel of it, and that it's a series of stone circles in enclosures. And what's special about it is that it was deliberately buried about 8,000 BC, 10,000 years ago. In other words, the site was in operation, at least this bit of the site, between roughly 9,600 BC and 8,000 BC. And then it was deliberately buried. And that's a really important thing to bear in mind, because virtually every other megalithic site in the world has not had that privilege of being deliberately buried. Virtually every other megalithic site in the world has been exposed for thousands of years and has been tramped over by later cultures. And I would suggest that the carbon dating record has been contaminated by later cultures who may even have moved megaliths around. And I think that the antiquity of Göbekli Tepe suggests very strongly that we should reconsider the dating of virtually all megalithic sites around the world. I don't think we should buy anything that mainstream archaeology is saying about those sites. What I'm talking about, we're in one of the areas of the new archaeology that's going on at Göbekli Tepe now. There's a huge megalith with a figure of a lion carved into it, and what Schmidt is telling me is that the main area that we know now, these four main enclosures, that there's at least 20 more of them, and there may be as many as 50 of them under the ground that they have not excavated yet. And rather alarmingly, from my point of view, he says that he doesn't plan to excavate most of them. It sounds really good, it sounds really politically correct, we should just preserve the site by never taking a look at it, but honest to God, I would really like to see every one of them excavated, and I'd like to know exactly what's going on at that site. He thinks it might go back as much as 14,000 years. He expects, because this is his paradigm, that the older material will be simpler, because one of the puzzling things about the site at the moment is that the very oldest material is the best, and the younger material is much poorer in quality. So he hopes he's going to find a standard evolutionary scenario. I suspect he's not going to find that. I suspect the oldest material is going to remain the best at Göbekli Tepe. And this is the unfinished megalith. You can see the T-shaped form of it, and I'm in the picture just to give a sense of scale. Thought to weigh about 50 tons, was not removed from the quarry because it fractured before it was completed. But you know, we are looking at very serious megalithic architecture here. I think we should be reconsidering Baalbek. I wish we were going, but none of us want to have our heads cut off on YouTube. This is not perhaps the moment to go to Baalbek. Santha and I have made provisional plans to go back on the 28th of December or thereabouts. Hopefully things will be a bit easier then. We just don't know, you know, what's going on with these gigantic megaliths from Baalbek, which underlie the Roman Temple of Jupiter. I think it's a bit arbitrary of archaeology to give this whole temple to the Romans. And I would suggest that there's a strong possibility that it is a two-phase construction as well, and that the Romans simply appropriated a much earlier megalithic site and built their temple on top of it. And again, if we go back to Göbekli Tepe and look at the generally circular pattern and the whole look of the thing, I think it calls into question the dating of the temples of Malta as well, which are really quite similar in many ways, and which are attributed to the period between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago. This is Menidra, by the way. again, Maltese temples have been tramped over by so many later cultures that the whole carbon dating record is a complete mess. And I think that what we're seeing is the reference frame of archaeology, the paradigm of the past being imposed upon the evidence. I think Göbekli Tepe puts all of that evidence into question. This is the Hypogeum in Malta. It should be on everybody's bucket list. It is one of the most amazing sites in the world. It's an incredible underground realm, a place, I'm sure, for experiences in altered states of consciousness. I was struck by the some similarities between the Hypogeum and Dankiyu, where we went just now. Andy and I were discussing this quite a bit. I don't think either of us feel that Dankiyu was ever an underground city. It was an underground place for experiences which would affect human consciousness, and undoubtedly this is what the Hypogeum is, cut out underground, deep under the ground in Malta. And at the Hypogeum and around the Maltese temples have been found many examples of these goddess figures, so-called goddess figures, which again mainstream archaeology gives to the period between 5000 and 6000 BC, because that is when they are prepared to accept megalithic structures were built. However, goddess figures, we do know, go back much earlier than 5 to 6000 BC. The Venus of Willendorf is 26,000 years old. The Venus of Hull Fels, almost 40,000 years old. Vestonici, 20,000 years. Losel, 25,000 years. Why should the Maltese Venuses date to just 5 or 6,000 years, just because that happens to fit the picture that archaeologists are comfortable with about the story of our history? Maybe Malta and the Maltese monuments are much, much older than that. I think that, again, Göbekli Tepe raises that question. Inside the Hypogeum, you find red ochre marks on the ceiling, and it's interesting because of the use of red ochre in the Upper Paleolithic in the cave art, where frequently you find animal figures painted in red ochre. And a good friend of ours, Dr. Anton Mifsud, who's the chief pediatrician at the main hospital in Valletta, and a very gifted amateur archaeologist, is an absolute thorn in the flesh of mainstream archaeology in Malta. And he just keeps digging and finding new stuff, and he's exposed a horrific scandal at the Hypogeum, because it turns out that there was an animal figure painted on the walls of the Hypogeum, and it was the figure of a hybrid bison bull. And it was the cause of some arguments between Donald Trump, who was open to the notion that it might suggest the Hypogeum dated back to the Upper Paleolithic, and a certain F.S. Malia, who was the director of the museums of Malta at that time. F.S. Malia was absolutely determined that the Hypogeum did not belong to the Upper Paleolithic, and was not prepared to accept any evidence that might suggest it did belong to the Upper Paleolithic. So when the argument got hot, he simply had the bison bull scrubbed off the wall, and it's gone. Fortunately, there is some documentation of it, and Anton exposed this scandal, and I put it formally to the National Museums in Malta with very heavy backup from Channel 4, and they just absolutely refused to speak to us. They just would not answer the question. They would not deny it or affirm it, which to me is very suspicious behavior. So I'm sitting in the Maltese so-called cart ruts with Anton Mifsud here. And, you know, I have to say, some cart, some ruts, they are thought to date roughly to the period of the temples, perhaps a little bit younger. And nobody knows exactly what they are, but they're supposed to be less than 5,000 years old, according to mainstream archaeology. So it's inconvenient for mainstream archaeology that if you go diving off Malta, you find cart ruts down to 100 feet underwater. And therefore, bearing in mind the story of sea level rise, these cart ruts are certainly more than 12,000 years old. And I want to go now from Malta and jump over to the Balearic Islands, particularly to Menorca, which has its own extraordinary megalithic culture, largely given to the Bronze Age about 3,500 years ago by our friends the archaeologists. But I can't help noticing the distinct similarity between the T-shaped megaliths of Menorca and the T-shaped megaliths of Göbekli Tepe. There is a difference. These upper parts are separate. They're separate stones, but the overall appearance is incredibly similar to the appearance of the megaliths of Göbekli Tepe. And again, I think Göbekli Tepe is a game changer, and I think it's going to require us to reconsider the dating of all megalithic sites, pretty much all, some perhaps not. And then you have the megaliths of Morocco, which I think we need to be taking the whole story of the Sahara. You know, the Sahara is like an ocean, and it's hiding things as a result of climate change. Sea level rise hides things. The Sahara, the drying out of the Sahara hides things, particularly when we find ancient maps which show huge lake systems in the northern Sahara. This is the Mediterranean Sea, here is Spain. And what are these gigantic lakes doing in the Sahara? You have to go back 12,000 years, the end of the last ice age, to find lakes like that in the Sahara when the Sahara was green. This is our planet, beautiful planet from a Russian satellite as it looks today, but it hasn't always looked like that. There were, during the last ice age, the last ice age reached its maximum about 21,000 years ago, and it was mostly gone by 10,000 years ago. And at the peak of the ice age, the last glacial maximum, you had ice caps that were actually 2 miles deep, sitting on top of North America and on top of Northern Europe, and creating a very different world from the world in which we live today in lots of ways. But one of those ways just concerns the outlines of the continents. This is how they look today. This is how they looked during the Ice Age. There was no Red Sea, for example. There was no Arabian Gulf. Southeast Asia was a gigantic continent, not a series of islands and peninsulas, called Sunda. The geologists call it Sundaland, which extended far off into the Pacific. Papua New Guinea was joined to Australia. Everywhere, coastlines were greatly expanded. And actually, what happened with the meltdown of the Ice Age is that 10 million square miles of land, which is roughly the size of Europe and China added together, was submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the last Ice Age. How can we possibly get to grips with our past if we don't take account of the fact that we've lost 10 million square miles of the record? And why is the main resources of marine archaeology devoted on looking for shipwrecks, you know, when we really should be exploring the lost lands at the end of the last Ice Age? The famous Piri-Reis map, famous because of the argument that it shows Antarctica. Okay, Piri-Reis map, relevant to our trip. It was found in the Topkapi Palace. It was drawn by Admiral Piri-Reis, who wrote a big book of navigation, the Bahariya. And he tells us in his own handwriting, this is only a fragment of a world map that he created. The rest of the map has been lost. He tells us in his own handwriting on the map that the Piri-Reis map, his map, was based on more than 100 older source maps. And he tells us that those source maps were in such a fragile, disintegrating state that he decided to preserve the information on them by creating a copy, a new map, which was a composite derived from 100 older source maps. And we see, amongst other things, the west coast of Africa here, the east coast of South America, and down here we'll come to the issue of Antarctica. But I'd just like to draw attention to this thing here, which is this island off the coast of North America, which does not exist today, but which is in the place of the Grand Bahama Banks. And the Grand Bahama Banks were a large exposed landmass at the end of the last Ice Age. And it's really interesting that running up the middle of this island is a row of megaliths placed in a line, exactly like the controversial Bimini Road, which lies underwater on the Grand Bahama Banks. In preserving the information on those older source maps, Piri-Reis seems to have preserved a time when the Bimini Road was above water on an island. That is really, really fascinating if you stop to think about it. The other issue is Antarctica. It's been a subject of great controversy for decades, but it does seem to show a greatly extended South American coastline butting into an enlarged Antarctica as it looked during the last Ice Age. Now here's Antarctica as it looks today, and here is Antarctica as it looked on honest maps of the early 1800s. When I say honest maps, I mean maps based on the navigational knowledge of that time. This Russian map from the early 1800s shows nothing where Antarctica is. And that's honest because in 1800 we hadn't discovered Antarctica. It was discovered in 1818. So when you draw a map in 1800, how can you show Antarctica? The anomaly is that Antarctica appears on many maps from earlier periods, from the 1500s, 1600s, maps like the Piri-Reis map that were based on older source maps now lost, like the Orontius Phineas map, which shows a greatly enlarged Antarctica in exactly the right place. Or several of the Mercator maps, which again show us Antarctica in the right place. Well, the scholars don't like this either, and they say, look, you know, those map makers, they just wanted to balance the world. They felt that there should be something heavy at the bottom that would balance it, so they put an imaginary Antarctica there, and by chance it just happens to look really like Antarctica, as it looked during the last ice age. This Ptolemaic map is interesting for a tiny detail, and that is the island of High Brazil, depicted off the coast of Ireland. You couldn't find High Brazil in 1513 because it wasn't there, and a ship was an inappropriate vehicle to find it in. What you would have needed was a time machine. If you went back between 12 and 13,000 years ago, you would have found an island in exactly the right place, of exactly the right size, exactly where this map says it is. Again, a suggestion that maps based on older source maps incorporate knowledge of the world that is anachronistic, that should not be there according to the prevailing model of history. It looks like somebody was mapping the world very accurately during the last ice age. How do we explain that? This map, the Waldseebühne map, shows a greatly extended Southeast Asia, much more, I would say, like the Southeast Asia of the Ice Age than like the Southeast Asia of 1507. And while we're on the subject of Southeast Asia, let us go and visit the island of Java, where something very interesting has recently rocked the world of archaeology. And that something very interesting is Gunung Padang in West Java. The site has been known for a long time. It's been known actually since about 1914, and it has been attributed to the period between, it's old, they accepted it was old, they attributed it to the period between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, which does not disturb the mainstream model of history. That is the period when people are allowed to have built megaliths. Until along comes Danny Hillman, the senior geologist at Indonesia's Geotechnology Center, who has been conducting an extensive survey of Gunung Padang for the last 5 years. And he has now published, and he says that on his evidence, he's sorry that he's upsetting a lot of people with this, but Gunung Padang is definitely older than 9,000 years, and it could be up to 20,000 years old. It's another Göbekli Tepe, if you like. It is a piece of hard evidence that is rewriting history. He says it's a strong case, but not an easy case. We're up against the world's belief. And this is views of Gunung Padang, and Santa and I will be going there in May when we're making an extensive trip to Indonesia and also to Australia. It's built out of basalt, which forms these hexagonal patterns. And bearing in mind that architectural style, it's interesting to hop over here to Ponape, which also happens to be on the precessional grid, which lies 54 degrees of longitude east of Angkor. Remember, 54 is half of 108, 108 is 72 plus 36. And on Ponape, we find hills rather like Gunung Padang, and which turns out to be an artificial hill. And we find megalithic architecture based on hexagonal basalt, same construction material. And this is Nan Duwas, which is the most prominent structure of Nan Madol. And again, you can see the similarities with Gunung Padang in the construction. And it's making me wonder about the whole dating sequence at Nan Madol, especially when we remember that Nan Madol stands on the edge of the sea, a sea that was once much lower. Sea level rose actually by 400 feet at the end of the last ice age. And if you go down here, if you go diving, you find that the ruins continue underwater, and they continue down and down and down. And as you get deeper, you find huge pillars rising up out of the seabed. This is a very spooky place to dive, I have to say. The visibility is poor. The local legend is that there's an underwater city there, which is guarded by 2 gigantic sharks. And when you're in that murk, your mind can't help playing on the prospect of gigantic sharks. They just come along and swallow you up. Again, more of these pillars and columns that are found underwater, some of them fallen. Very interested in this one in particular. because of its similarity to these fallen pillars, which are found on the island of Tinian, not so far away, which happened to be the island that America launched the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki from. I think we're looking at something very similar here, and it again raises questions over the age of the Tinian megaliths. And let's just pop into Japan briefly. Here is Japan today. Here is Japan as it looked 12,400 years ago, 10,400 BC, give or take a few hundred years. Hokkaido is a separate island, but Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu are all joined into one landmass. And that landmass has a deep inlet here and here. Interestingly, an ancient map from 1424 that shows Japan, where it's called Satanase, the Pisagano chart, shows it with these two inlets in exactly the right places, and shows it as one landmass. In other words, this map of Japan, made in 1424 from an earlier source map, actually shows Japan as it looked 12,400 years ago. How do we explain that? Well, we go diving in Japan. And Santha and I put in hundreds and hundreds of dives around Japan, 200 of them are off the island of Yonaguni, which mainstream archaeology insists is entirely natural phenomenon. Strange natural phenomenon, but natural nonetheless. Like these two megaliths, for example. Well, these two megaliths, they fell into place there from a cliff overhead. And luckily they didn't break when they fell from the cliff. They perfectly slotted into that gap, and that's the explanation for them. The fact that the cliff is actually 500 feet back from the place where these megaliths are found does not deter that explanation at all. But that is the official explanation. There are the two megaliths side by side, and here's this huge outcrop of definitely natural rock, I don't dispute that. But let's swim around here now, going east, and let's see what we find. And what we find are the famous terraces of Yonaguni, and with these beautifully cut stairs and steps in them on a very large scale. I'm not sure what Yonaguni was, but I am sure it's man-made, and I believe, having put in 200 plus dives there, that I can say so with some authority. There are many visiting firemen who've gone into Yonaguni, many of whom don't really even know how to dive, who've been taken down fighting for their lives by Japanese divers who've showed them a few minutes of the site, who've left and said it's completely natural. But if you really work the site, and you work it over a period of 4 or 5 years as we did, and you repeatedly dive on it, and you study all its details and aspects, then you begin to be absolutely persuaded that this is a man-made site. There's just too much going on there to allow for it to be entirely the work of nature. If it was the work of nature, the argument goes that there are soft and hard layers of rock here, and that the sea beating against this cliff face, as it was, as the sea level rose, selectively removed the softer layers and left the harder layers in place. It's not as an absurd an idea as it sounds. This is sedimentary rock. But then my question is, where is the debris that the sea swept away? And where I want to see the debris is at the bottom of this drop-off here. There's the steps. I want to see the debris down here. But I don't see the debris down there. What I see is a clear pathway with all the debris nicely cleared to one side, which I would say is a sure handiwork of man, not of nature, particularly since there's a gutter along this side of the path. And let's go to the face now, the gigantic face that's underwater at Yonaguni. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth. Again, the mainstream says, oh, you just recognize faces everywhere, you know, it can't be a face, it's just a natural thing. It can't be a face at all. I'm in there for scale. It's huge. There are pupils in the eyes. Interestingly, if it's natural, interesting how nature chose to separate the head off from the bedrock behind it in that way. And interesting how there's a headdress. Just the remnants of a headdress here that you can see, I think, quite clearly there. And as we pull back away from it, we find that it's situated in a context. this large flat area in front of it, and again, gutters, 2 gutters down the side of this pathway here. I'm absolutely certain that this is a man-made structure, and I'm certain this is as well. This is, to me, this is the one that they can never refute, and nobody has refuted it. And this is the Kerama stone circle, some hundreds of miles north of Yonaguni, off the island of Okinawa, of a group of islands called the Keramas, about 40 miles west of Okinawa, of the Okinawan capital, Naha. And there we find small river stones cemented to the seabed, and we find this gigantic stone circle, which is not built, it is cut out of the bedrock. Cut out of the bedrock the way the Sphinx is cut out of the bedrock. And you can see, again, the scale here of this thing, the central upright, the surrounding megaliths. And let's just get in a bit closer and take a look at it. The surrounding megaliths make a kind of spiral around the central upright. And you know, I'm impressed by the way the outer curve of the central upright is matched by the inner curve of the outer uprights here. I see no way that nature could have made this. I think it's absolutely convincing. It's 110 feet underwater. It's been underwater for more than 12,000 years. It therefore doesn't fit in to the conventional view of history. We will pop over now to Easter Island. Easter Island is the exception that proves the rule, because Easter Island today is not quite on the grid. It's about 60 or 70 miles off the grid, about a degree of longitude off the grid. What's interesting is that during the last glacial maximum, Easter Island was much bigger than it is today. And Schock again was making this point in his in the talk that we heard on the bus. That Easter Island was a much larger place, and that the largest of the archipelago that was Easter Island was precisely on the precessional grid. And this begins to raise the question, which I thought Schock did very well in the talk we were listening to tonight, of the age of the Easter Island monuments, which has traditionally been given very young, 700 to 1,000 years old, really. They're supposed to be these famous moai and the ahu on which they stand. But if we go around behind this moai, we can see that the ahu is a rather poorly made ahu, and that constructed into it indeed is an ancient Easter Island head. And this is the key piece of new evidence that Schock has brought forward, which concerns the issue of the age of these structures in the Ranararaku crater. Because, as he pointed out, these heads go far beneath the ground, and they have been covered not by some sort of landslide, not by some sort of tidal wave debris, but by sedimentation, by not 700 or 800 years of sedimentation, but by thousands of years of sedimentation. And Thor Heyerdahl showed us how deep these structures go. And Schock's view is that we may be looking at 10,000 plus years of sedimentation, 10 to 12,000 years of sedimentation, covering the gigantic buried figures of Easter Island. And anybody who's been to Göbekli Tepe and to Easter Island cannot fail to note the similar aspects of the megaliths of Göbekli Tepe and the megaliths of Easter Island, particularly the hands on this figure, which cross above its waist, just as the hands on the Easter Island figure do. Rather extended figures, that crooked elbow and the hands joining at the waist above a sort of belt. Very, very similar. And again, we find that similarity. You'll see this in the museum at Urfa, in this figure, which is roughly of the same age as Göbekli Tepe, and which was found in Sanliurfa, and again, the hands joining at the waist like that. Again, I'm covering material that Schock covered in his talk that was played on the bus, but it was Thor Heyerdahl who first drew attention to the astonishing similarity between this ahu in Easter Island with its huge and perfectly constructed megaliths in jigsaw puzzle patterns and the megaliths of Sacsayhuaman in Peru. That it seems to be the same style of architecture. And I'm actually not sure whether it's Schock was saying maybe it was Easter Island influencing Peru, maybe it was Peru influencing Easter Island, which was Heyerdahl's idea, or maybe it's a remote common source influencing both of them. It could be, but there's definitely something in common with these patterns. And there is no historical source that tells us the Incas built these walls. The Incas, I believe, found these walls. The only document we have which speaks of the Incas trying to move a stone on this scale describes them as miserably failing, and 3,000 of them being killed in the attempt to draw it towards Sacsayhuaman. We don't have any account that tells of them successfully moving stones on this scale. And a group of local researchers, Jesus Gamarra and his deceased father before him, are making a strong case that the rock-cut features of Sacsayhuaman and the Andes in general date from a much earlier period, and that the megalithic walls from a period slightly after that, and the Inca stuff is relatively poor and recent. There are vitrified stone and precision cut channels at Kenco in the Andes. You have this amazing site of Ollantaytambo, and interestingly, on the walls, the megalithic walls of Ollantaytambo are carved step pyramids. And if we pop over to Tiwanaku in Bolivia, not so far away, we find a step pyramid, very ruined, the Acapana pyramid in Tiwanaku, and here the structure called the Calasasilla. And again, I made the case in Fingerprints of the Gods that Tiwanaku may be much, much older than the 1500 or 1000 BC that it is attributed to. And part of that, again, is astronomy. It's too detailed to go into at this time of night, to do with changing position of sunrise on the summer solstice, but puts it at about 10,000 BC, the gateway of the sun being involved in that alignment. On the reverse of the gateway of the sun, annoyingly for Egyptologists, we have a mammoth. Not Egyptologists, I mean, archaeologists in general. See, the problem is that mammoths went extinct in South America more than 12,000 years ago. So to have those two big ears, the two eyes, and the two tusks of a mammoth on the gateway of the sun suggests that the gateway of the sun might be 12,000 plus years old. They say it's birds, actually. They say it's two birds. I don't see birds there somehow, but that's what it's. But these are birds, but I don't see this as birds. Interestingly, there's H-shaped blocks at Tiwanaku, and they remind me of the H-shaped motifs that we find at Göbekli Tepe as well. Let's hop over to, let's just take a look at these monoliths at Tiwanaku, which again have got their hands crossed in rather the Göbekli Tepe way. No, I don't think they're holding alien ray guns. What I think they're holding are snuff trays, actually. And this has been argued by ethnobotanist Manuel Torres, that these are snuff trays and other paraphernalia for the consumption of DMT. The powdered seeds of Anadenanthera colubrina and Anadenanthera peregrina, and that they do resemble snuff trays still found in the Amazon today. Interestingly, Francisco de Orellana made a long and unexpected trip down the Amazon in the 1540s. He actually thought he was going off on a half-day hunting expedition, but the Amazon carried him all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And on the way, he observed many large and sophisticated cities along the banks of the Amazon, which he reported in his adventure. And he spoke about the tribes and their skill and what he saw, highly civilized peoples in the Amazon. Later on, it was considered to have made all this up, because of course the Amazon is pristine jungle. The idea that there could be human civilizations in the Amazon completely absurd in terms of mainstream archaeology, and obviously Orellana was just making it up to glorify himself. Well, so it was believed until the relatively recent and horrendous and devastatingly sad clearances of the Amazon, which have revealed the remains of gigantic cities in the Amazon. And those cities were depopulated soon after Orellana's time. And they were depopulated by smallpox, which the Spanish introduced to the Americas. And which, by the way, the smallpox was deliberately introduced in Tenochtitlan by Cortez. By the time Pizarro got to Peru, smallpox had already reached Peru. It had traveled faster than the Spanish could. and it devastated the populations of the lost garden cities of the Andes and of the Amazon. And it's now clear that the Amazon is a human-engineered zone, that people have been working the Amazon for thousands and thousands of years, and that it is not pristine rainforest. It is a habitat that has been effectively created by human beings, and one of the most interesting aspects of that habitat is terra preta, the black soil of the Amazon, which is an amazing, miraculous, self-replicating soil filled with bacteria, constantly replenishes its own fertility. The scientific studies show that it goes back, somebody created this soil, it's a man-made product, at least 11,000 years ago. So is the Amazon like a desert, like the sea, like the ocean? Is it covering many secrets of the past underneath that jungle? And that's what the clearances are showing. Huge earthworks are emerging from the Amazon as it is being sadly cleared for cattle ranches. And even megalithic circles are being found in the Amazon. I think there's a whole lost civilization story to tell in the Amazon, and I intend to do so in my forthcoming book. I've already spoken about the remarkable feat of ethnopharmacology that's involved in the ayahuasca brew, selecting these two plants out of 150,000 different species of plants and trees to produce the psychoactive ayahuasca brew. That is a work of science. We are looking at an incredible scientific achievement that is vastly ancient in the Amazon. Trial and error would be most difficult. I've spoken of acacia nilotica, dimethyltryptamine, and the whole story of alchemt and chemistry and alchemy that we get from ancient Egypt. And I think we need to reconsider scenes like this from ancient Egypt, particularly since these stars are connected to the initiate through the pineal gland, and the pineal gland is the place that our endogenous DMT is produced. So I'm going very near the end of the talk now, you'll be relieved to hear. And I want to go back to this whole issue of the sky and the ground, and that an enormous effort seems to have been made to draw our attention to the period between 12,000 and 13,000 years ago. Are we being told that something of great significance for the world happened in this period? Something perhaps that led to the destruction of a great global civilization, something on a scale that would justify the initiation of gigantic astro-architectural projects around the globe by the survivors of that civilization, I would suggest. Something to mark and commemorate it. Well, this is where I want to talk about comets, and everybody remembers Shoemaker-Levy 9 in 1994, that freight train of a comet that fragmented, that was torn apart by the gravity of Jupiter, and that smashed into Jupiter with dramatic and horrific effects. Let me tell you that if Shoemaker-Levy 9 had hit the Earth, none of us would be here today. Our planet actually would be sterile. There would be nothing left of us. And this is the moment to say a deep and profound thank you to Jupiter. Thank you, Jupiter. Because Jupiter is the giant guardian of the Earth. Jupiter, circling in the outer solar system with its huge gravity, just sucks in the majority of comets that would long ago have extinguished life on Earth, were it not for the presence of Jupiter. And Jupiter is big enough to take it, whereas the Earth is not. But occasionally comets get through. And it's been clear since 2007 that there is a smoking gun. You see, when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods and published it in 1995, I focused on the period between 12,000 and 13,000 years ago, but I could not put my finger on exactly the smoking gun. I was talking about various theories to do with the end of the last ice age, including Earth crust displacement, and it was obvious to me that something cataclysmic had happened at that time, but it wasn't clear what. What's happened since, and this is one of the other main reasons why I'm writing a sequel to Fingerprints of the Gods, is the growing evidence that our planet was hit by a gigantic fragmenting comet 12,900 years ago. There's been a lot of argument about this. The argument has gone back and forward. A lot of academics have objected to the comet, but the new research that keeps coming out is absolutely convincing, and there's really no doubt anymore that a comet did hit the Earth roughly 12,900 years ago, and that it was responsible for what is called the Younger Dryas. Geologists have been aware of the Younger Dryas for a very long time, but roughly from 12,900 years ago down to about 11,800 or 11,700 years ago, we had, just as the Earth was coming out of the last ice age, we had a sudden deep freeze, an unexpected, anomalous, massive deep freeze of the Earth's climate. which was responsible for the extinction of huge numbers of animal species at that time. And it's called the Younger Dryas, but what caused the Younger Dryas has not been clear until we have the comet evidence. And what the comet evidence tells us is that the comet was responsible, that it sent up a huge cloud of dust into the upper atmosphere, that the dust reflected back the sun's rays, that the Earth froze rapidly for about 1,000 years, and it was a horrendous time to live on Earth. And I believe that it wasn't only hunter-gatherers and large animal species that became extinct at that time. I think that's when we lost a whole civilization. Of course, the mainstream view wants it just to be hunter-gatherers that were wiped out, but I think we need to be reconsidering all of that evidence now. This is now very much entering the mainstream, and I think that we cannot consider any questions of the origins of human civilization without taking this comet impact into account. Getting very close to the end now, we'll hop over to the Temple of Horus at Edfu, which is rather like those maps. The Temple of Horus at Edfu is a recent place, it's Ptolemaic, but it contains on its walls the complete text of a much earlier document. This document is called the Edfu Building Texts. And what they say is that that document, which was inscribed on animal skins, was so fragile that they decided to preserve it and copy it onto the walls of a lasting memorial, which is the Temple of Edfu. And here are the Edfu building texts, which speak of the homeland of the primeval ones that was destroyed in a great flood. By the way, that comet, very large fragments of it, hit the North American ice cap. That's why there aren't many impact craters, because they hit 2-mile deep ice. They flashed that deep ice into a tremendous heat. There was a huge flood released from the ice cap at that time. And just gigantic global cataclysm took place. And they tell how the primeval ones, the gods, I read the survivors of a lost civilization, came to Egypt and established religion by building primeval mounds up and down the land, which would form the place of all future temples and pyramids in Egypt. In Tiwanaku, we have those gods too. They're called the Viracochas. They're heavily bearded and mustachioed. They were said to have white skin. They don't fit the pattern of ancient American Indians at all. And we have the same story in Mexico, where those gods are associated with Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, also white-skinned and bearded, who came in a time of darkness to bring civilization to a devastated land, and who, we are told, was eventually driven out from that land, promising that he would one day return. It was that promise that Cortez was later able to take advantage of, promising that he was one day return. Interestingly, when he was driven out of the land, he is said to have left Mexico on a raft of serpents. Very curious idea. He sailed away on a raft of serpents woven together. I can't help note that at Göbekli Tepe we have a raft of serpents. They call it a net of serpents. There are their heads, and there are their bodies, all internested. They call it a net of serpents. That's what Klaus Schmidt calls it, but I can't help thinking raft of serpents, story of Quetzalcoatl. Many of these bearded figures are found throughout Mexico, and in the oldest archaeological layers, and I think they may be much older than those layers themselves. Even the figures on Easter Island, when you look at those huge chins, turns out they're bearded figures too. And this brings me finally to another bunch of bearded figures who weirdly are carrying man bags. See their cute little man bags there? And why is he wearing a fish on his head? You know, I mean, why is he wearing a fish on his head? He's called a fish-garbed figure. He is from Babylon, and he is associated with a supposedly mythical creature called Oannes, who emerged from the waters of the ocean after the Great Flood, bringing civilization to a devastated mankind. He was a restorer of civilization, a civilizing hero. He wears the head of the fish because he was able to survive the flood like a fish. In fact, he's described as a hybrid between a fish and a man. But I'm interested in these man bags that he's carrying, because we find the same man bag in the hands of the figure from La Venta, out there in Mexico, the feathered serpent and the same man bag. Now that's a very odd thing. It could be a coincidence, of course, but it's odd. And I'm beginning to wonder, are we looking at the symbolism of some kind of cult of survivors who spread around the world, and that this bag, I don't know, maybe it contained their stash of DMT, I'm not sure. This bag, you know, is their symbol. And archaeologists say that these are supposed to be tombs, but they look a lot like man bags to me at Göbekli Tepe. So, getting closer, I promise, to the end. Osiris, another bearded figure. There's a resonance, 72 conspirators. There's a resonance between the sky of 10,500 BC and the sky of today. Then Orion was at its lowest point, Draco was at its highest point, Leo was rising in the east, Aquarius was setting in the west. Today it's the opposite, Orion's at its highest point, Draco's at its lowest point, Aquarius is rising in the east, Leo is setting in the west. Halfway around the precessional cycle, half of 25,920 years. It's interesting that the refined estimates put the comet impact at 12,890 years ago, because just roughly then we find ourselves half a precessional cycle away from the closing of the Mayan calendar. Suppose, I'm asking, I'm not saying that the end of the world is nigh, but I'm suggesting that there may still be some fragments of that comet in orbit, that it may have been a long period comet. Very likely it was. What goes around comes around, and long period comets can have orbits of 12,000 plus years. And it's just possible that other fragments of the comet that hit the Earth 12,980 years ago are still in orbit and may be coming back. Remembering Shoemaker-Levy 9 again, it's interesting that the brightest object in the sky in 21 December 2013, just 1 year out, which is not bad calculation when we bear in mind the Mayan calendar, is going to be a comet. It's comet Ison. It's going to be brighter than the full moon. Good news is it's not going to hit us. It's going to miss, but we should keep an alert eye to the sky. Comets only become visible when they outgas. Outgassing is caused by proximity to the sun. They're often covered in a thick, tarry substance, and they can be completely dark to telescopes until they start outgassing. I think that the sense of a warning in the Mayan calendar cannot be completely ignored. There is a growing awareness and recognition that our planet is a sacred realm. And one thing's for sure is that the Mayan calendar in its last cycle measured a period of 5,126 years, which is the period from 3,114 BC to 2012 AD. And that, interestingly, is the period of the great cities. That's the historical period of urban life, of the big states, of the big centralized hierarchical religions, of the great corporations. That is the period that is coming to an end now. I think we all know it's broken. I think we all know a new model needs to be put in place. And the great thing about being human is we do have the power of choice, and we can make a better world if we want to, remembering the lessons of the past with reverence and with respect. So, thank you.